Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today we're going to go back to a little bit of the roots of this channel, and I'm going to give you some commentary on one of the new shows coming out from Marvel, which is Daredevil Born Again. And not just any commentary that anybody is going to give you. No, I do meta commentary on a show, not on the show itself. I'm going to talk about the producers of the show, one in particular, and take it from a Marvel podcast to let you get a feel for where this show is going to go and whether or not you're going to trust Marvel enough to actually invest your time into it. But before we get there, just to let everyone know, there is a link in the description and the pinned comment for my sign-up page for my new books, which are called Fade to Blue. They are a combination of film noir and Indiana Jones. They are set in my normal superhero universe, but in a different time. They're set in the early 1930s. You're looking at some of the beautiful art from that new book in the background. So if that is interesting to you in any way, go on over to the sign-up page and leave your email and you will be informed when the project goes live. So I was going to do a bit of a different video for this week. I was going to do one on whether or not you're ever going to trust Marvel again, because you have people like your boy Zach, Richard Meyer, over at Comics Matter, trying to promote things like the new Rogue Savage Land comic book and titling a video, "It doesn't matter if I tell you it's good, you're still not going to buy it," because he's very disheartened, because he thinks that if Marvel and DC fail, the entire comic book industry is gone. Now, I don't think that at all. But the thing is, I was going to talk about, well, basically his dismay over the whole thing, because he can't quite grasp the fact that people just don't trust Marvel anymore. It doesn't matter if they put out a good book here or there, you're just not going to trust them. It's like, let's say Joker takes over Gotham City, and he doesn't just take it over. He has an elaborate plan so that he puts a whole bunch of his cronies into the government positions for Gotham. And all of a sudden, one day, he just says, "I'm in control now," and everybody who's in his control, who runs the government of Gotham, rips their masks off and says, "Yes, we all work for the Joker," and the entire city is under his control. And under this fictitious story, let's say Batman comes in and defeats Joker. And then what happens after that? If you lived in Gotham, would you be okay with all of those people who were running the government, who ripped off their masks saying, "We work for the Joker," putting their masks back on and saying, "Yeah, we're just government employees"? Don't you remember? Would you trust those people to run your city? Well, no, you wouldn't, because they ripped their masks off. You know they work for the villain. And that's what it is with the comic industry and with Marvel and with DC and with Disney itself. They've ripped their masks off and told you, you can't trust us. We are your enemy. And now, of course, they've been defeated and they're putting their masks back on and saying, no, we're just the lowly people who run these things. We're not the bad guys. We're not your enemy. And people like Richard Meyer are going, "Look, they put out a good book. Obviously, they're not your enemy. Let's support them again." No, I'm not going to support them again. And I think the same thing is true with Daredevil Born Again. And I'll give you the reasons why. Now, quite honestly, I went over to Marvel just as a lark because I was listening to Wes over at Critical Thinking talk about some of these newer podcasts at Marvel, and I thought I'd go over and see what was there. And I saw one which was posted about Daredevil Born Again 3 days ago from our old friend, Sana Amanat. She has now worked her way up to being an executive producer of Marvel shows, which includes Daredevil Born Again. And I'm going to go over that interview, taking little bits out of it. You can watch the entire thing on YouTube if you want. I'll have the link for it in the description. But I'll show you exactly the fact that this woman and Marvel and Disney are trying to slip that mask back on, but at the same time, it's the same old product that you're going to get underneath. And funny enough, as I used to cover these things all the time, I would always say, the way that you listen to any of these podcasts or read any of these articles written by people who are heavily on the left, your quote-unquote progressive people, is to understand that they argue in a very specific way. They don't do it in an academic, honest way, wherein you would present your thesis and then use the body of the article or your podcast or whatever to prove by points why your thesis is correct, then at the end, repeat your thesis to see if your audience agrees with you or not. And hopefully you've presented enough factual material to convince them that yes, your thesis is correct. But that's not the way your quote-unquote progressive, far left-leaning people argue and do podcasts and do interviews. No, they take you on a windy, twisty road of emotion and then don't give you their exact point until the very last moment. And that type of argument is to do one specific thing. It is to get you to agree with that end statement by, first of all, hiding it from you till the very end, and almost in a story fashion, have you agree with it because you've journeyed down this emotional path with them and agree with the turning points of the path because you're being emotionally manipulated. Pure and simple. And on that note, this interview did not disappoint. I'll show you the exact thing by giving you the end first, the very last thing that Sana Amanat says. Her interviewer asks her at the end, "Do you have anything to say directly to the fan?" And Sana Amanat answers this way. And by the way, you'll notice that she always answers the question by saying, "Yeah," and then giving her answer, which is a bit of a verbal tick, but also a very, very small emotional manipulation tactic in order to present positivity first, in order for you to be primed positively in order to take in what she's about to say next. So she says, "Yeah, I think I'm so excited for this show to come out. I'm so nervous. I want people to know, and people know, hopefully. Some people know me by now. I've been here for so long, but I love what I do. I love Marvel. I love our characters, and I freaking love these characters. I love Daredevil. I love Wilson Fisk. And I think we put our heart and soul, and of course, we had challenges. We had our creative challenges, and we really made, I think, the best of what those challenges were. And frankly, I think it made the show better. And so we put our passion, our heart, our soul into the show. And really, I just hope people see that and understand that, we came to this as fans first, and then creators and producers. And I just hope that they join us for this ride and trust us and trust that we're going to make something really special." So there's the point at the very end. You see, it is, we want the fans to trust us again. They put that mask back on and they want the fans to trust. And they should trust them. Why? Because of emotional reasons. Because they love all of these things. She gives a long list of all the things she loves. They've poured their heart and their soul into it. Again, emotional. And so you should trust them. They're, of course, fans, which they spent the last 15 years showing you they're not fans. But no, now they're fans. Trust them. Trust them. Now, before I move back to the first of the article and give you the supporting evidence as to why you cannot trust these people, why this is all emotional manipulation, let's first take a step back and just for a brief moment give you the reasons why not to trust Sana Amanat in particular. I have multiple videos on this woman on my channel because she is the death of Marvel Comics for the last 15 years. If you want more on why that is, just put her name into the search bar of my YouTube channel and you'll get videos that will tell you exactly why. But she is basically a far-left progressive activist that was brought into Marvel to shape the way that Marvel comics were made, even though she had no experience within making comics except for 2 years after being out of university at a small indie company where she did we don't know what. She was hired at Marvel to completely restructure the way Marvel made comics and what their comics were about. Why? Because of her family ties to heavy progressive activism. Of what kind? Well, at that time, her brother, who was a millionaire because of a startup, some kind of tech startup, became an executive producer of movies in Hollywood. He was known as the most powerful man in Hollywood that no one knew the name of. And he wrote an entire thesis about how to literally insert progressive activism into the production of movies. Well, I shouldn't say movies because he meant all mediums, although he was focusing on movies. He was heavy into progressive activism because his entire family was heavy into progressive activism. They lived in New Jersey and created something called the Amanat Family Trust, which had heavy connections to the Democratic Party, to the Clinton Foundation, and was used to promote, quote-unquote, progressive ideological points around the world. And his point was to do it through entertainment. He, by the way, has since been arrested and convicted, put into prison as the judge called him, a serial swindler. Why? Because he was using political connections to get people to give him money for things that never actually were going to materialize. How did he do that? With his connections to the Clinton Foundation and to Hillary Clinton herself. So basically, the political organizations like the Clinton Foundation and the Amanat Family Trust gave him their support to tell people, yeah, he can be trusted. He took their money and then did things with it which he wasn't supposed to, most probably, in my opinion, kicking some of that back to those two institutions. And he got to do it over and over again, so much so that the judge called him a serial swindler until they finally caught up with him. His connections and the connection of Sana Amanat with the Clinton Foundation and the Clintons themselves is because their first cousin, who Sana Amanat calls a sister because they grew up in the same household, is Huma Abedin. Huma Abedin was literally the right-hand man, right-hand woman, of Hillary Clinton as she was running for president and director of the Clinton Foundation. Those of you who know anything about the political know that Huma Abedin got into a bit of hot water when she was appointed to such positions because a number of senators said, no, you can't do that because her father actually has ties to Middle Eastern terrorist organizations. Her father, of course, growing up in the same household as Sana Amanat and her brother, as their uncle, because their father brought him over from the Middle East. And the basic reason, if I'm going to break it down, as to why these senators did not trust this man and his daughter was because he had done some magazine articles and some speaking engagements where he basically said these people, these organizations that the United States government would consider terrorist organizations in the Middle East are really not terrorist organizations. Actually, they're the good guys. Now, let's go through the interview about Daredevil Born Again, and I'll show you exactly that the apple does not fall far from the tree. By the way, I love this new thing on YouTube where they give you transcripts of the videos. I'm going to read from the transcripts so I can give you some timestamps if you want to go look it up as well. And I may actually put some of them in the background, but it's not the best transcript in the world. Sometimes they do get words wrong. So at about 2 minutes, Sana Amanat introduces herself, says she's been with the company for 15 years now. That would be Marvel Disney. She talks about how she started out as an editor of comic books. She got to collaborate with artists and writers. Then she shifted gears into the development of animation and eventually got to Marvel Studios, started working with live action content, became a small executive producer within the Marvel Studios with Miss Marvel, and is now an executive producer here on Daredevil Born Again. This, by the way, is the trajectory that every employee at Marvel really wants to go through. And not only that, it is what they're trained to want. I did a video about Klaus Janson, who used to be an inker for Marvel and then developed into a consultant for Marvel. He still works for them slightly today. He is a great friend and collaborator of Frank Miller. And he did an interview, which I covered, where he talked to the people at the Will Eisner School for Sequential Art, which is where Marvel draws their talent from, to some extent, the college-educated people, so to speak. And he said, yeah, this is what you should shoot for. Now, he was talking about it in terms of Frank Miller, but yeah, this is what you should shoot for. That was his message. Not make great comics, not make great products, but climb the ladder. Now at about 3:40, she starts to get into the meat of it. And she talks about how they're going to tell this story through a different lens. Now this may seem like a small point, but I did a video on Sana Amanat and her own podcast where she talked to other people who were working at Marvel Comics at the time where she was, and how to use lenses to ensure that the lived experience of the marginalized people who were working for Marvel could project that into the story itself. They talked about this at length. And so I do not think it is a throwaway term she is using here. So she said, quote, they're going to tell it through a different lens. We're going to tell it from a different perspective with different creators, and then quickly slips the mask back on by saying, to an extent. She then talks very briefly about the two actors who are coming back to play Daredevil and Kingpin, and then says, we kind of reframe the story to be able to tell it from that perspective of these two formidable opponents who are, in a weird way, are so similar. Now that's where you get the first hints of where she's leading you down this emotional path. And what is this emotional path she's going to lead you down to? Well, it's something, again, she did entire podcasts about when she worked for Marvel Comics. It's about the fact that, sure, you have someone who's called a hero and someone who's called a villain, but is the hero really a hero? And is the villain really a villain? And as we go down through these quotes, you will see that she talks about Matt Murdock Daredevil in a negative sense, using negative descriptors, but when she talks about Wilson Fisk Kingpin, she talks about him in a positive sense, using positive descriptors. Also, at around 4:30, she talks about the showrunners for this new Marvel show and says that they were the ones who did Loki and Moon Knight for Marvel. That's not a ringing endorsement if you ask me, but then she continues by saying, that combination of creators really understood the importance of the old show and loved it so much as I loved it, and we wanted to create an extension of that, but still have our own take on it. So basically, the old show did great, and so we want people to harken back to that idea, but we're going to take creatives from two different shows that really didn't do well, and they're going to give their new take on the entire thing, starting from the first point of trust the old show. And then she goes on to talk about Daredevil, Matt Murdock, using these negative descriptors. I'll give you a bit of a longer quote. But also, even after saying, oh, she's such a fan of Daredevil, she worked on the book herself, she knows this character, she doesn't know this character. So at about timestamp 520, the interviewer asks, and oh, by the way, these interviewers for these podcasts, but this one in particular, asking these questions is so wooden. You know that these questions are being read off of a cue card. You can literally tell from the tone in her voice. This is the exact opposite of what the Marvel podcast used to be back in the time when Sana Amanat was running the podcast. So again, another hint of, yes, they are trying to slip that mask back on. But anyway, the interviewer asks, what we've seen previously of Daredevil is high-stakes action sequences mixed with scenes that reflect morality, motivation, and justice. What is the tone being set in Daredevil Born Again? And Sana Amanat's answer is, I think it's still that very much. So I think we have that combination. I think we might be doing it a bit differently than the old show, mainly because you have different directors and different filmmakers and all of that. But 100%, I think that was what made the show so special, is that you had these really impactful, emotional scenes. Yes, like about morality, about the concept of, flawed, violent characters. That is an important component of our show. And what's interesting about this iteration is we are talking a bit more about violence and the power it has over these individuals, and like hating that power and yet succumbing to that power. And that is really sort of, I think, the way in for us. Like, we're going to have moments, of course, of intense violence and intense action sequences. And then she continues on for a moment about the two characters, Daredevil and Fisk, and then finishes the thought about 650, where she says, they're both trying to be different individuals, but also as they're living their day-to-day lives and they're attempting to be these different people, that is where a lot of the emotion tends and the drama is going to live. And then she says, I'm happy with the balance we found, so it was a really awesome experience. Now again, once again, drawing on my experience listening to this woman talk about Marvel characters and being the vice president of character development and content at Marvel Comics, she has said similar things before. What the meaning of these statements are is the fact that she doesn't believe that violence is the core, or conflict is the core of these stories anymore. It's the progressive values that are presented along the way. They just use the conflict and the violence as the emotional punch in order for you to stay there long enough to see what the emotional core is that they're selling. And this emotional core is, as it always is with these podcasts and these people, one of how do you use power correctly? And when I say correctly, when they say correctly, they mean in a quote-unquote progressive way. And of course, as I have talked about before in this video, and will talk about a little more as I get into it, the basic core value of what they're trying to sell is your heroes aren't really heroes, and the villains aren't really villains, which is basically to say there's a gray morality. Look, see, the villain is probably the good guy. And of course, this is a quote-unquote progressive staple because, of course, the only way that the progressive ideology can sell its actual trail of inconsistent ideas, to say the least, is by showing you that no, there is no right, there is no wrong, there's only gray. And since there's only gray, the only thing it comes down to is power. But let's continue on. At around 8 minutes, she talks about how the comics are the inspiration for all of this story. But the way she does it shows you exactly why these people took over comics to begin with 15 years ago. It's to say, we're going to use those old stories that people considered great and were great stories, and then we're going to retell the entire thing in a new way, in a quote-unquote progressive way, and they're going to be the new stories which we look backward at all that history, that lens we look backward through. So the interviewer asks, were there any particular comics that you reference as part of the creation of these characters or plotline? Now you would think that since this show is called Daredevil Born Again, and Frank Miller produced the story of Daredevil Born Again, you would think that if you're going to talk about comics, the number one thing on the list would be, let's talk about Frank Miller. But actually, Frank Miller is at the bottom of this list. Guess who she starts with? Chip Zdarsky. Her answer is literally, yeah. I mean, of course, like Chip Zdarsky and Charlie Soule's run on the Mayor Fisk runs, that was a really big part. They had some really cool characters that Chip introduced. What Chip and Charlie Soule did was definitely the starting point for us, and we will always forever be inspired by Edward Baker and Brian Bendis's various runs on the character. And in terms of tone, Frank Miller, of course, is always going to be the foundation of every Daredevil story. She actually says, of every Daredevil story that we write, but we're not doing an adaptation of Born Again. I honestly think that little is very telling. She has to stick Frank Miller in there at the end because basically they're going to use the title of Daredevil Born Again to draw people in to think it's a Frank Miller story of Daredevil Born Again when it's not. They're saying, oh yeah, that guy, who's his name? Oh, Frank Miller, yeah. Oh, we're doing his story. Yeah, we're doing his story, but through the lens of Chip Zdarsky and Charles Soule and Brian Michael Bendis. And why? Well, because Frank Miller's Born Again is about Daredevil. Is about Daredevil as a hero, a redemptive hero, really. But the Chip Zdarsky run on Mayor Fisk is about Wilson Fisk, is about the Kingpin. And that's why they have to start off with Chip Zdarsky, because this is not really a Daredevil story. This is a Kingpin story. What they're going to show you, what they're going to give you is, yeah, sure, we're going to flip back and forth between the two, but again, who's really the hero here? Sure, Daredevil is called the hero. Sure, Kingpin is called the villain, but we're going to make Kingpin much more relatable and much more accessible to the audience so that they're going to identify with him because he's really the hero here. And that's obvious from her comments, I think, from about timestamp 9:45. She starts to talk about Matt Murdock, Daredevil, and says the following. Our characters are constantly evolving. Now, right off, that should be a red flag. But anyway, I could say constantly changing and becoming more human, maybe something like that. But constantly evolving, now that has a different connotation. But we know at the end of it, it's what these characters, who they are and what they represent, what they stand for. And Matt Murdock being someone who is a contradiction, who is someone who looks for justice in any capacity. And whether that means he's going to be wearing his lawyer suit or whether that means he's going to be putting on his Daredevil suit, he is going to be fighting for justice. He'll do it through the court system. And if he can't get it through the court, he's going to put on that suit and he's going to use his baton and fists, which in itself is maybe problematic. But I think that's what makes him such a captivating character because his belief system is very rigid. His belief is, I'm going to find justice and I'm going to protect my city. And so understand that at the core of it, I think makes it still true for both forms, and also understand that people believe that in our everyday lives, we want to be able to find justice and we want to fight for it in any means possible. So once again, I apologize for the janky sound of how that entire thing came out, but that was a literal reading of the transcript. She has verbal tics, which interrupt herself over and over again. But anyways, this here, I think, is the key point of no, she doesn't understand Daredevil. She says, Daredevil is going to try to put on his lawyer suit and try to get justice that way. But if he can't get it that way, then he's going to put on the Daredevil suit and get justice that way. That is not how Matt Murdock Daredevil works. Not in any way, shape, or form. Maybe in the new Chip Zdarsky version of it, but no. If we're going back to Born Again, if we're going back to Frank Miller, if we're going back to the original Daredevil, that's not what he does. Yes, he is there for justice. Yes, he fights for justice, but not, oh, I can't get it through the court, therefore I'm going to beat the guy up. It doesn't work that way for someone who's actually seeking justice, especially Daredevil. It's actually quite the opposite. He goes out and he catches criminals because he's seeking justice through two different paths. Not one that is an extension of the other because the first one failed. No, these are two separate paths to justice. These people don't understand that there are nuances to justice and you can pursue two different paths to justice at the same time that are parallel to each other but don't interact. But what he is doing is he's going out and capturing criminals because he has extraordinary abilities, and so do these criminals. And so in order to capture them, you need to have extraordinary abilities at your disposal. And so he uses his extraordinary abilities to capture these people and then bring them to justice. And then he continues his pursuit of justice through other means, which is the legal means, which is the way that these people, when they get to court, will themselves have to go through. It is not that Daredevil and Matt Murdock fail at being a good lawyer and so go beat the guys up. It doesn't work that way. If you think that is what the Daredevil character is, you do not understand Daredevil. Are there storylines where he does that? Yeah, because he's failing at being a hero. And he must correct himself at the end, saying, that's not right. I didn't do the right thing there. But no, this is the heart of what she thinks the character is. And of course, she will explain away, I'm sure, the fact that that's what the character used to be because he's since evolved. But again, if you see the negative way that she uses language, calling him problematic, again, listen to other podcasts where she used that word very often. She would, as a feminist, describe stories like the one where Miss Marvel, the current iteration of Captain Marvel, was basically mind-controlled and then abused, let's just put it that way, in order to have a supervillain's child. Problematic. That's what she sees as problematic storylines. She's calling Matt Murdock problematic. It's more than what you think when she uses that word. And then moves on to talking about that problematic part of Matt Murdock, about how he really doesn't pursue justice. Not really, because he'll just go beat you up if he doesn't get his way in court. That's problematic. Why? Because he has a very rigid belief system. What is that rigid belief system? Well, it's right and wrong. It's there's right and there's wrong. And why is this going to resonate in the story? It's because, as she says at the bottom, because people today are thinking that way. They're going back to thinking about the fact that things might be right or wrong. And of course, this show must show them that no. Go back to thinking that everything is gray. And those statements that she made are contrasted right after with the following statements about Wilson Fisk, starting at about 10:45. She says, same thing with Fisk. I think what's so intriguing about him and what I find him to be the best villain possible is that his background as someone who has a very tragic story with his father and his mother, it does ground him in a different way, and it does showcase that he has something to prove, that he will sort of, every single time you replay it, he's constantly beating his father to prove that he is the most powerful and he will not be taken down. And I think that pathos makes him one of the most intriguing villains and also makes him unstoppable because in some weird way, you kind of root for him to win, even though he's a terrible person. And ultimately, and then she cuts herself off and starts again by saying, but there is that relatability. And then she continues to talk about both of the characters in terms of their internal compass and their North Star, which she says they used all the time in the production of this show. So again, let's go back and look at this quote about Wilson Fisk. You see how she's using positive words in order to describe him? You see how she wants the audience to relate to him. He has pathos. Who has pathos usually? It's the hero. The hero is the one with pathos. Now, I use pathos in the old Greek way, that is to say, to suffer. He has suffering, but she uses it, again, know this from previous videos, she uses it in the modern writer's context way, which is, as she describes right here, presenting the pain of the character so that the audience will relate to them. And that's exactly what she's trying to do here, trying to get the audience to relate to him. She even says it. You will kind of root for him, even though he's the terrible person. I would say she probably wanted to say, even though he looks like the terrible person. Because of course, you got to relate to him. Of course, she has to put in that emotional baggage that he has about his father basically abusing him. Of course, you got to relate to this character. And that, as she says, makes him the best villain possible, the most intriguing villain, an unstoppable force of power, who ultimately is the one you're going to root for. Why? Because his North Star, his moral compass is better than that of Daredevil's because he exists in the gray. And then after that, she continues on to talk about the story. About 12 and 13, she talks about the brutality and the violence of the story. She says, the show shows the brutality of both the characters, and you will see that we didn't want to glorify violence by any means, but as she continues on later and says, it's a dark, dark thing. And it's certainly the darkest of any project she's ever worked on, and that she thinks is the darkest project that Marvel has ever created. And she says, it is because that's why you need a hero, and that's what the show is about. But if you just spent the last interview bad-mouthing the hero and talking up the villain, I don't think that's what you actually mean. I think the reason you want to have a dark show is because if you take someone into darkness, then they might be relieved to go back to the gray. And of course, bring the entire thing back to the very end, which is to say, now I've taken you down this emotional path. Hopefully you're going to trust us and then consume the product. And then consume the ideas behind that product. Because as she said other times, what are superheroes for? They're for pushing progressive ideas. She calls them positive ideas and then goes on to describe them as progressive ideas. But she literally said that in the past. Superheroes are for pushing positive, progressive ideas. Which again is no surprise because her brother, who was an executive producer of movies for Hollywood, many that you've probably seen, wrote an entire thesis on how to use entertainment to promote progressive ideas. As he, by the way, operated in the gray area where he was buddied up with the Clinton Foundation, and when the court systems, which have a rigid interpretation of things, got a hold of him, they sent him to prison. And is also not a surprise when her uncle, who lived with her family while she was growing up, writing defense articles saying that declared terrorist organizations really weren't that bad. If that's the mentality you grow up in, what do you think you're going to produce when you get older? If that's your family, if that's your upbringing, if that's the way you're taught to think, what are you going to do? Are you going to trust her? I obviously don't think you should. Why? Because her entire interview here is showing that she and the other producers of this show, Daredevil Born Again, and Marvel and Disney are all saying, take my hand, trust me to lead you back into the gray. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there is a link in the description and the pinned comment for the sign-up page for Fade to Blue, my new books which are coming out. Go on over, leave your email address, and you will be informed when the project goes live. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.